This is my favorite road on the island. But I suspect that my fascination with relinquishments of agency stems from an interplay between a childhood characterized by surges of quite ill-regulated anxiety, but also an adolescence spent really working hard to mask my being queer. So those two aspects of my life made me feel like a knot in wood most of the time, until as a young adult, I finally dared to let go a little and be myself. And poetry is, in my view, a perfect medium for engaging with relinquishment, because poetic form, and specifically the characteristic of enjambment, the overflowing of one line into the next due to an absence of terminal punctuation at the end of a given line, allows for a dynamic interplay. And that interplay is between perhaps restriction and freedom, perhaps between song and silence, linearity and jaggedness, possibility and failure. One of my all-time favorite poets, Carl Phillips, describes poetry as depending on patterning and the intentional disruptions of our expectations that patterns can afford. So making many of my favorite poems consider that disruption of patterns also keeps them shifting or relinquishing order as a means of meaning making. So here's a poem from my first book, On High, where you can see the tension between relinquishment and control in full force. The title is Ars Poetica, which acknowledges Horace's poem, Ars Poetica, which the Poetry Foundation website usefully defines as a poem that explains the art of poetry, or a meditation on poetry using the form and techniques of a poem. Ars Poetica. When I was 9, my passion was making creatures thrive in terrariums. I'd bend pine needles into a bridge, pad a sphagnum bed, lean 3 chips of shale together for a cave. So when an orb weaver wouldn't web between the twigs I'd poked in the substrate, or a bull snake refused to wind on a smooth beach stone, an intense desperation gaped in my head. The bus breaks. A woman across the aisle runs a line of lipstick all the way to her ear. Her pocket mirror grabs at features. They magnify like burls. The first time I heard the only constant is change, I wrote it down to remember. I wrote Ars Poetica before I read the book that inspired the bulk of the critical exegesis on poetry and activism that served as the second half of my doctoral dissertation. And that book was The Poetical Wager by the poet and critic Joan Retallack. In The Poetical Wager, Retallack considers how the precarity at the heart of our human condition, namely the fact that at any moment our lives as we know them can take a drastic swerve, undoing everything and opening previously unimagined possibilities, might compel us to reconsider what poems and poetic form can do, especially when catalyzing change in the world. Aligning herself with the Roman poet Lucretius, Retallack defines swerves as the sometimes gentle, often violent, out-of-the-blue motions that cut obliquely across material and conceptual logics. In turn, she reminds us that the more we open ourselves to the spontaneous tragedies and flickers of grace that will inevitably but also unexpectedly reframe our lives, the more we can begin to rethink habits of thought that structure our lives even though they create only a semblance of order. Centering as opposed to bracketing the influence of swerves on our lives and emphasizing the swerves in our poems transforms each repeated habit into a new action that just happens to resemble an action that happened in the past, so that the fragility of our existence and the precarity of our routines vault into focus. A swerve, in its unpredictability, is by its very nature an agency reducer. The habits we repeat through our days are mere chimney cinders in a blizzard, and art needs to remind us of the swerviness of the world. So looking back on the poem Ars Poetica with Retallack's swerves in mind, I can see such swerves are in play despite my then ignorance about her whole approach. The terrarium becomes a futile attempt at control, in which imprisoned living beings reject and resist the child's insistence that they remain impossibly perfect. The jarring shift to the bus scene, with the stranger lipsticking her cheek, enacts a literal swerve and its trace on the body. And the final couplet, in which I archive an aphorism from the late S.N. Goenka, who was the head teacher of Vipassana meditation, further ironizes the futility of controlling the ephemerality of our lives by trying to crystallize it into words. That the poem itself is also a hybridized sonnet, organized into stanzas, or just simply the groupings of lines made separate by spaces between them, a little like paragraphs in an essay, just a little. This also matters because in Italian, stanza translates to room. When I teach stanzas in creative writing and English literature courses alike, I encourage students to consider the interplay of security and porousness that most habitable rooms must contain. Encouraging writers and critics to think of stanzas as simultaneously closing off and opening up helps to narrow our focus on the intentional way lines progress down the page. Often I'll take the opportunity to offer an analogy using one of my favorite words in the English language, and that's breeze blocks. The breeze-blocked carports of my childhood, growing up in the South Okanagan, sheltered us from the elements as we played street hockey in road warrior pads, or this game called Red Ass with a dog-chewed tennis ball, or mimicked the WWF Raw is War we watched on television with dust pans and patio cushions. But amidst our constant enactments of violence, honestly, breeze blocks dappled the ground with petals of sunlight, and they wisped wind across our skin. So a stanza, no matter how packed with action and memory and imagery, still needs to let the weather in too. Now, I think more than ever, since we have to think about weather in new and swerving ways. As Steve Collis puts it in A History of the Theories of Rain, there's some doubt as to whether we will ever be able to say, remember climate change? I would say a breeze-blocked approach is integral to the contemporary stanza's construction for that reason. The British poet Jack Underwood, in his essay on poetry and uncertain subjects, does not mention breeze blocks, unfortunately, but he does raise a similar metaphor when talking about poetic form. His is more about porousness more broadly. You deliberately build your poem as an open habitation. You have to learn to leave holes in the walls because you won't and can't be around later on to clear up any ambiguities when the lakes of your readers' lives come flooding up through the floor. Here we see Underwood enacting his own relinquishments of control. He crafts and punctures with limits and failures in mind. And importantly, he makes space for swerves of miscommunication. I suspect each of you has a story of a time when misunderstanding led to a chain reaction of social explosions before, I hope, there was some clarity. In the relationship between a reader and a poem on the page, I find that sometimes that clarity never comes. As soon as I read Retallack's exhortation to make space for swerves in our poems, I framed my dissertation, half of which was theory, and half of which eventually became my second book of poems, Unbecoming, as a reckoning with the way our lives will inevitably veer off course. I wanted to write poems that could interplay the tensions of making statements of certainty and eventually protest, while also self-reflexively making space for unpredictability. What of intimation, of audience, of form, of image, when the world keeps shifting? What of outrage, of judgment, of frank demands, if a poem is meant to also defamiliarize the present? I was actually a little lost doing that work, in large part because I began to fear that my own fascination with the slipperiness of making a statement was overshadowing or blurring the statements themselves. But then a swerve in my own life, one that is about to swerve this presentation, changed my sense of the stakes of a poem entirely. I became a dad. And in becoming my son Eddie's ancestor, I began to confront a new tension between two imbricated necessities. First, the Ritalic-inspired necessity that I accept the instability and limits of my agency, that I make space for more uncertainty in my poems. But second, and in light of that uncertainty, the necessity that I lean into the frank, certain, and unconditional love I newly felt for a representative of the next generation. My own demise may, or should, no longer be the end of the line. And I began to hear an echo there in terms of the way my own silence is no longer the end of the poetic line. What to make of such certain love, and the way it cuts through the predominant state of uncertainty in which we presently find ourselves? How might having the particular stake in the next generation brought on by parenthood change one's own accountability? Dramatizing that transformation toward a new accountability, here's how my second book, Unbecoming, begins. In this poem, I will just let you in on this. Actually, I guess this is also streaming, so I'm doomed. But this poem was initially called Toast. Thank goodness I removed the title altogether, so that's good. This is it. To be coming apart. To be coming apart. To be coming apart. To be coming apart. Of late, my interest in the way the formal qualities of poetry allow for explorations of relinquishment has manifested in a more pointed sense of accountability, a new commitment to being part of whatever will come next, and further on, whatever will have been. And my reckonings with being someone's ancestor, and thus feeling differently responsible to the future, have inevitably become a rumination on humanity's collective devastation of the planet. It's important to note here that our collective devastation is also, as Catherine Mockler puts it in the introduction to the 2019 anthology of climate justice poems, Watch Your Head, predicated upon social inequalities and embeds future inequalities. And that's because questions of colonization and decolonization, racism, anti-Blackness, and other forms of forcibly maintained social inequalities, exclusions, and persecutions cannot be separated from the question of the climate and the planet's eroding natural environment. What are we leaving the next generation? And more frankly, what will Eddie think of how much I've done to stop the disaster, the ways I've confronted my complicities, and the extent to which I've considered, to quote Mockler again, the complexities, contradictions, and convergent points of this crisis. So in this presentation, I will share some of my own poems from my latest manuscript in progress, which is titled Empties. And they're the ones that exemplify my responses to these questions. The title Empties functions on two levels here. Empties as a verb, and empties as a plural noun. On the one hand, in poems that meditate on the shift from descendant to ancestor, my speaker contemplates emptying himself for the sake of his child and becoming more future-oriented in light of his newly solidified place in his child's past, i.e., he desperately hopes to be his child's predecessor. On the other hand, empties as a plural noun, meaning drained and discarded entities like cans, cartridges, and jars, permeate these poems. They are from a world that is husked and untenably extracted, in a world that is teetering toward collapse. However, and I think this is really important to point out, we cannot forget that only an empty bottle can sing. So here is one of the poems titled Empties. There are a couple from the collection. Empties. And who isn't my neighbor now? We alley bottles mouthing, ooh, when gusts prowl. Empties blown into a chorus. Wind, song. What difference if air grazes or emits our lips? Aren't all voices lifted, stolen? Have not we all awoken tossed in drifts or on unshrinking mountains of rink snow? Stranger, kin, as this weather draws us together by drawing our low moans, be just, be unjust, just be drawn, lest we both. Interplayed with my own poems, I will also examine 3 contemporary poems that complicate the figure I ambivalently take up in Empties, a figure I would cheekily call the eco-poetic dad. The Chamorro poet Craig Santos Perez's poem, Age of Plastic, the British poet Simon Armitage's poem, The Present, and the American poet Campbell McGrath's poem, At the Ruins of Yankee Stadium. All 3 of these poems react to the certainty of climate change, making the world more uncertain for their children, but they respond with differing attitudes. Santos Perez's speaker imagines a state of permanence for his daughter so that she might outlive us all. Armitage's speaker reckons with the evasiveness of the present by ruminating on its homonym, the present as a gift that he leaves his child, a gift that dissolves before it can be given. And McGrath's speaker finds solace among waterlogged ruins sometime in the future. Before I proceed, I have to admit that I personally struggle with my own self-alignment with eco-poetic dads due to my being queer. As a bisexual man, I have never felt more invisible than in a group of other dads performing often normatively father behaviors. So, like at soccer camp or around a barbecue. I often desert the dads entirely in my work, preferring to find inspiration in works by poets like Joss Charles, for her work at the intersections of trans embodiment, language, and ecology. Or one of my heroes, Henri Cole, who in his poem Recycling makes the following joke: I have no biological function, and so I grow like a cabbage without making divisions of myself. C.A. Conrad's book, Eco-Deviance, in which his somatic rituals put him in physical danger as an ecstatic and joyful queer provocateur. Julie Justin's Knot, which ties knots of intimacy in the blank spaces of the page. Prathna Lore, Liz Howard, Stevie Howell, Mary Jean Chan, Kaveh Akbar, Cody Caetano, and so on. However, today I talk dads because Empties, and by extension this presentation, posits the heteronormative crises of relation that happen at lacrosse practice or around the grill as foundational to the problem of working collectively to address climate change. If I can't enter into meaningful conversation with other dads who invariably want their children to thrive in this wounded world, despite disparate and potentially violent understandings of gender and desire, how can I work more broadly in solidarity with those who seek to upend our day-to-day lives for the sake of a better future, or more devastatingly, no future at all? For that reason, at one point in Empties, my speaker reflects on entering the palace of bros, the hockey rink. What better place to mobilize a response to climate change than over an artificially maintained sheet of ice? Thus, in this presentation, as I focus on the interplay between a desperate desire for stability and the resolution to attempt relinquishment in poems by eco-poetic dads, I will return again and again to the echo at the heart of these works, a careworn and frayed utterance of longing. Uncertainty is the only certainty, and yet. Here is my poem, Brinks, from Empties. It's set at Colloquium Beach. Maybe you know this road. Brinks. I had so much of everything. Time, produce, drugs, poems, a finger on my own off button. Now, an ancestor, I owe my son for making me owe him what remains of this world, to cherish as it brings. His last year in the nursing home, Grandpa Ed's stories shed plot points with each retelling till it took our whole family to fill a stranger in. Mumbles between constellations of dying stars. Driving past Mistaken Road, I pulled over last night to take its picture with my phone. But when Eddie, stirring, muttered, "What are we doing here?" I couldn't, peering back, see a sign. Along the bottom of Brinks runs a quote broken into segments from Stefano Harney in his and Fred Moten's interview with Stephen Choukaitis in The Undercommons. It's kind of hard to show the interplay of the quote interspersed with sections of the poem in PowerPoint form. So here's the quote in its entirety, and I've just broken it with backslashes underneath. So, it's not that you wouldn't owe people, or you wouldn't owe your mother, but that the word owe would disappear, and it would become some other word. It would become a more generative word. Taken together, the poem and the quote are meant to feel palimpsestic. Generations, temporalities, geographies, obligations, memories, and possibilities swirl and coalesce, unresolved and irreconcilable. And amidst those asterisms of lineage and futurity, a new sense of accountability grows, a feeling of puniness in history and in space, and simultaneously an increasing sense of gravity at the center. In this poem, love becomes an impossibly concentrated element around which everything, everyone, and every time swirls. As Jack Underwood puts it in his essay collection, Not Even This, Poetry, Parenthood, and Living Uncertainly, during a discussion of a similar shift in selfhood he felt after becoming a father, I'm reconciled to the fear of love. It is so strange how readily expendable I feel, not the same as wanting to die, but a total willingness to die should the need arise. I am ready to plunge my hand into the whirring machinery, to gulp the poison down, take it safely inside. Other fathers told me about a hyper-protective instinct they discovered, a bristling new aggression and primed attentiveness to whatever threat might enter the mouth of the cave. But I have never felt or conceived of this threat as material, snarling and prehistoric, or lurking behind a hedge near the swings. I've just experienced a shift in my personhood. I'm not the important one in my life anymore. Though I will admit to you that I did surprise myself by getting really into powerlifting for the first year of Eddie's life. I also, for the most part, share Underwood's sentiment that fatherhood feels less like a reaction to threat and more like a subtler shift in selfhood. Though I sometimes pout about it in the morning because I'd rather be writing in silence over, say, a cup of coffee with my own shreds of thought amidst the onslaught of Dragon Master's audiobooks. My life now also has a streamlined and clear hierarchy of priority. Eddie's cry will trump whatever else I'm doing at all times, and I would gladly exchange my own cry for his at any moment. It is their variety of takes on Underwood's articulation of this shift of self-perception, the I'm not the important one in my life anymore, that creates a dire sense of urgency in other contemporary parent poets' poems about climate change and accountability, and specifically in the works of the three poets I'm examining today. His essays in Not Even This laid the groundwork for some of my self-positioning in Empties, but they also opened rather than covered the conversation on the place of the parent poet in the climate crisis, because the COVID-19 pandemic began as Underwood was in the middle of writing his book. So as a result, those essays focus on an imminent threat of the virus and not climate change when he theorizes a poetics of precarity. I also think here it's crucial for me to note that of course, having a child is not the only way one becomes motivated to care about the future of our planet. For instance, there's a rich history in queer theory that rejects the idea that having children need be the catalyst for developing a social conscience. Maggie Nelson succinctly and beautifully historicizes the debate about whether children should be the focus of our efforts to better the world in her essay, Riding the Blinds. She writes, "Many movements aiming to make the world a better place, from Black Lives Matter to Fridays for Future to Standing Rock to Never Again to Families Belong Together, frame their actions as service to children and the unborn. In other words, they make recourse to reproductive futurism." Nelson then shows how reproductive futurism, the idea that social and political movements are trying to change the world for the sake of future generations, and then pulls it apart in various polemics that have been set up as a counter to queerness. For instance, she quotes Lee Edelman's provocation that queerness names the side of not fighting for the children, before responding as follows. "Before we bliss out on some sublime indifference to that which will post-date us, we might recognize that indifference to their, i.e. future generations' fate, is arguably no different from dumping a bunch of toxic waste guaranteed to poison whoever comes into contact with it, and then contending that because you won't know the sickened people personally, or won't be alive when they get sick, or because you just aren't that into people anyway, especially small ones that cry on airplanes, you're off the hook. The climate crisis cannot wait until we have purged people of their allegedly wrong-headed attachment to reproductive futurism." What I like about the way that she transitions out of this quote is that in the end, Nelson echoes Guattari as she encourages us to face the climate crisis with a kind of unified disunity, a pragmatic solidarity without solidity. Nelson's perspective is certainly not perfect, but I do find myself returning to it because of its brazenness. I've shared these passages here to add yet another level of dissonance to the noise of a world teetering on the ledge of even more catastrophe. At the end of this presentation, I'll turn to Roy Meeke's conception of the word hunch to complicate matters further. In diving into poems by eco-poetic dads, I think it's also important to take a moment to define a key term just so that we have it hovering in the margins. Joelle McSweeney's coining of the necro-pastoral when thinking of the current state of our planet. In an introductory essay that is usefully titled, "What is the necro-pastoral?" she defines it as follows. "The necro-pastoral is a political aesthetic zone in which the fact of mankind's depredations cannot be separated from an experience of nature, which is poisoned, mutated, aberrant, spectacular, full of ill effects and affects. The definitive processes of the necro-pastoral are decay, vagueness, interembodiment, fluidity, seepage, inflammation, supersaturation. The necro-pastoral is not an alternative version of reality, but it is a place where the farcical and outrageous horrors of Anthropocenic life are made visible as death, the obscene, that which should be hidden away, but forces its way in through the membrane. An obscene event is an apocalypse." What does it mean to parent past the tipping point, among vibrant, oozy, zombified remains, rather than with a living world? Of course, such a definitive sense of before and after is not possible to parcel out, but I suspect we've all been places where sickness is palpable. A river plugged with garbage, a hiking trail stippled with dog shit bags ostensibly left to be picked up later. Any photograph of the tar sands, like this one by Bertinsky, or a photograph that is physically made from oil, like this one by the Métis author and artist Warren Carreyrou, which he calls a petrograph. The first eco-poetic dad I want to examine is the native Chamorro poet Craig Santos Perez from Mong Mong, Guam. I'll be focusing on a poem from his collection Habitat Threshold. Santos Perez also finds motivation in McSweeney's concept of the necro-pastoral In an essay titled Teaching Eco-Poetry in a Time of Climate Change, he states that the necropastoral aims to make us look at death, sin, evil, fear, and destruction so that we might consider our mortality, morality, and ethics. Sometimes fear wakes us up better than romance. I find that sentiment to be the case in his poem, Age of Plastic, in which his speaker wishes a terrifying transformation on his own daughter so that she might live longer. Age of Plastic. The doctor presses the plastic probe against my pregnant wife's belly. Plastic leaches estrogenic and toxic chemicals. Ultrasound waves pulse between plastic, tissue, fluid, and bone until the embryo echoes. Plastic makes this possible. My wife labors at home in an inflatable plastic tub. Plastic disrupts hormonal and endocrine systems. After delivery, she stores her placenta in a plastic freezer bag. Plastic is the perfect creation because it never dies. Our daughter sucks on a plastic pacifier. Whales, plankton, shrimp, and birds confuse plastic for food. The plastic pump whirs. Breast milk drips into a plastic bottle. Plastic keeps food, water, and medicine fresh. Yet how empty plastic must feel to be birthed, used, then disposed by us, degrading creators. In the oceans, 1 ton of plastic exists for every 3 tons of fish. How free plastic must feel when it finally arrives to the paradise of the Pacific Gyre. Will plastic make life impossible? Our daughter falls asleep in a plastic crib, and I dream that she's composed of plastic so that she too will survive our wasteful hands. In the case of this poem, printed in grayscale, save for the emboldened word plastic, riddling the lines with its indelible presence, I am reminded once more of McSweeney's invocation of the obscene in her definition of the necropastoral. The obscene, that which should be hidden away but forces its way through the membrane. In Santos Perez's speaker's case, that which should be hidden is the obscene sentiment that forces its way into the poem via the dream, at a time when the speaker's agency is reduced. He dreams that his daughter, composed of plastic, will survive us. The father, fearful of being himself a degrading creator, desperately seeks to redeem and protect. Every time I read this poem, the word I feel the speaker groping for in desperation is certainty. Certainty as stability and certainty as permanence, given the uncertainty a microplastic-sown world embodies. By emboldening plastic throughout the poem, its shimmering lines become speckled with it, like the waters and also like our bloodstreams. A terrible new substance comes. If only it were so easy to pluck plastic out of nature as it is to spot in these lines. Simon Armitage's poem, The Present, from his 2017 collection, The Unaccompanied, tells, at least at its most basic level, the story of a failed icicle hunt. The speaker wants to bring back an icicle for his daughter. Here, though, ice-porting practicalities and broader questions of legacy and agency interplay in evocative and, pardon the pun, slippery ways. The present. I shove up through the old plantation, larch out of season, drab, drained of all greenness, widowed princesses in moth-eaten furs, and stumble out on the lap of the moor. Rotten and rusted, a 5-bar gate lies felled in the mud, letting the fields escape. Winter is late and light this year, thin snow half puddled, sun still trapped in the earth, sludge underfoot all the way to the ridge, and none of the stuff that I came here to find, except in a high nick at the valley head, where a wet, north-facing lintel of rock has cornered and cupped enough of the wind for running water to freeze. Icicles. Once I unrooted some 6-foot tusk from the waterfall's crystallized overhang, lowered it down and stood it on end, then stared at an ice age locked in its glassy depths, at far hills bottled in its weird lens. These are brittle and timid and rare, and weep in my gloved fist as I ferry them home. I'd wanted to offer my daughter a taste of the glacier, a sense of the world being pinned in place by a diamond-like cold at each pole. But opening up my hand, there's nothing to pass on, nothing to hold. In response to his inevitable relinquishment of the present as a gift and as an evasive increment of time, Armitage's speaker, in similar though perhaps less horrifying ways than Santos Perez, also claws at the fantasy of certainty. He craves a sense of the world being pinned in place by a diamond-like cold. Pinned here evokes lepidoptery, a hobby of collecting and pinning butterflies, another transformation from the flits and flutters of life to the arrangement of creatures under glass. But of course, by the time the speaker gets home, the certainty has slipped away. Returning to my earlier discussion of enjambment, the overflowing in a poem from one line to the next in the absence of terminal punctuation, like a comma or a dash or a period, and the ways enjambment can illuminate incongruencies and amplify tension in the stanzas of a poem, we can see in the present many crucial moments where the elaborate construction of Armitage's stanzas is productively undercut by the way lines trickle down the page. Take, for instance, the following emphasis on the word weep, which suggests the act of crying despite the sentence being a practical description of how melting works. These are brittle and timid and rare, and weep in my gloved fist as I ferry them home. The poem is full of dynamic doublings because, in the end, it's the speaker's failure that is the greatest gift. The nothing he holds by the time he returns demands that he relent in his attempt to control the future. And yet, at the same time, the overgrownness of the landscape he treads across on his way to the icicle nook in the rock, with its dilapidated gate allowing the fields to escape, suggests that rewilding has been occurring. This is not a mastered landscape, and this is not a poem about the triumph of a man. Instead, Armitage captures the constant transformation of matter and ends on a bewildering image of futility, of fragility, and of motion. My poem Sirens presents a more despairing eco-poetic dad for its speaker, a speaker who begs his child to hold off giving up, even if he himself has failed to fix the future. And by fix here, I mean both the act of fastening into place and also the act of repairing something broken. Sirens alludes to Homer's Odyssey, passing by an isle populated by sirens whose irresistible song lures sailors to their deaths on the rocks. Odysseus demands that his crew plug their ears with wax and keep rowing, while he, bound to the mast, also endures their tempting song. Sirens. When I cut your cord, it whirled and bound me to the mast. Now, however long I have, I hear the most bewildering song. You can't be blamed for deserting a ruin. To our rocks turn, seclude from fear. Let me be the one who writhes. Don't yet unstop your ears. I'm very grateful to the poet A.E. Stallings for her suggestion that I change this poem's title to Sirens, and this time around I'm not telling you the original. But I like the doubleness of the mythological singers and the sound we hear at the time of an emergency. The poem at base is meant to signal a longing to sustain my son's innocence for as long as possible, to hold off the despair and resignation I fear he'll feel when he learns the extent to which our planet is in crisis. Already, his favorite Netflix shows like The Octonauts allude to the facts that ice is melting and tigers are nearing extinction and bee populations are decreasing. When one of these revelations really hits home and he blurts his outrage or overwhelm or grief aloud, we often calm him with shushing and hugs, the way we do when he wakes from a nightmare. Sirens posits that the waking to the climate crisis goes in reverse. The speaker accepts that his son will wake into nightmare instead, but he aims to prolong a sweeter dream. The last eco-poetic dad poem that I wanted to offer today is At the Ruins of Yankee Stadium by Campbell McGrath from his newest collection, which is called Fever of Unknown Origin. It's an incredible cover also. I put it last because somehow McGrath's speaker posits the fear of waking into nightmare as an act of wonder instead of an experience of terror. The poem is extremely long, so I've only snagged a few moments, but I also just really couldn't help myself. I wanted you to have a feel for the flurry and the fluidity of McGrath's thinking. What you need to know first and foremost is that At the Ruins of Yankee Stadium begins in April, on a day chock full of French bulldogs and ornamental tulips superimposed atop the old, familiar, unevictable dirt. McGrath's speaker is in New York, and before turning to the climate crisis, he creates a huge list of New Yorkers doing stuff, just all kinds of things simultaneously, creating like a whooshing or spiraling collage of activities. And McGrath calls this a relentless negotiation with multiplicity, a constant engagement with the shape-shifting mob. He beckons us to feel a sliver of the churn and swirl of all his possible neighbors in this world's iconic city of possibility. Here are some of the things New Yorkers are doing in the poem. This is just like a tiny sliver. I appreciate all the feedback. I got to cut this passage down because it's very long, so just 3 lines. And you can imagine why it kind of starts to feel a little overwhelming to listen to. Snoozing, sniffling, cavorting, nibbling, roistering, chiding, snuggling, confiding, pub crawling, speed dating, pump shining, ivy trimming, and on and on and on and on and on he goes before admitting, I've lost my train of thought. Berries, the city, people, bricks, the past. There's something about the past bubbling into this poem so rampant with the present that makes McGrath begin to shift the focus and the register and to make his speaker begin to intimate something more personal, despite all his descriptive and rhythmic mental gymnastics in describing the activities of others. Simply put, he dares to face, for a moment, toward the future. And these 2 stanzas, I think, are vital. So, in turn, the poem's eco-poetic dadness vaults to the fore. For McGrath, the climate crisis is simply another permutation of our demise, a demise and all its impending hopelessness that is brought on by our optimism and our capacity to flex and respond and change the qualities that he sees in his fellow New Yorkers, but also in his own family. He portrays the human condition as doomed to hope and damned to thrive. He is certain that our resilience is also our greatest vulnerability. And in turn, the poem dives into the cross-currents of ruination and transformation as he imagines what will have been in some not too distant future. And it begins with one of his son's utterances. I remember the parties we used to throw on Jane Street. Decades later, we discovered a forgotten videotape, and our sons, watching with bemused alarm, blurted out, "Mom, you were so beautiful." She was. We all were. Everyone except the city. The city was a wreck, and then it was a renovation project, and now it is a playground of privilege, and soon it will be something else, liquid as a dream. But water is not the end. People will live in half-flooded tenements. People will live on houseboats moored to bank pillars along Wall Street. It's all going under. Time is with us viscerally, idiomatically. Time inhabits us like a glass bowl filled with tap water at the kitchen sink and some little pink stones and a sunken castle with a child's face etched in a slate gray window. Fish swim past, solemn as ghosts, and the child smiles sadly, wondering, perhaps, how bees will pollinate underwater. He seems a little melancholy. He must miss his old home, a skin-honeyed hive of multifarious humankind, a metropolis of stately filth doused in over-rich perfume. The castle door swings open and the boy emerges like an astronaut stepping warily onto the moon. When he sees us through the warping lens of the bowl, watching him with desperate, misfocused passion, we are as cartoonishly gargantuan as the past, and he as spectral as the future, raising one small hand to wave goodbye. So, what do we do with all that? The child's wave to those submerged in the waters of the past reminds me of Stevie Smith's poem, Not Waving But Drowning, in which a frantic gesture for help is misconstrued as a friendly hello. The glibness of the final farewell in this poem, from the future we have not yet encountered that will inevitably evade and exceed us, is to me highly unsatisfactory. The child's wave, like a wave of water, skims over all the suffering and destruction that will accompany the terrible, certain uncertainty of our collective future as the world keeps warming, and as many, afraid and clinging to what they know and what they love, go full ostrich and pretend nothing's happening, desperately willing it all to be fine. Take, for instance, the chant of Drill Baby Drill, which is literally the act of sticking our heads in the sand, specifically the tar sands. McGrath's image of a small child waving goodbye is not, to me, enough. Surely we must all believe that, despite the vibrant precarity of our present, we are more than just cartoonish caricatures as we grapple, in earnest, with the degradation we're leaving the children of the future. But that sense of glibness is also, I think, the poem's greatest power. It provokes in us a hunch that we are more than a collage of idiosyncratic activities. The late, great poet, theorist, and activist Roy Meeke borrowed from the conceptual poet B.P. Nichol to assert that a hunch, with its dual meaning of both an intuitive sense and a physical posture, suggests the transition from imagination to action that a poem can incite in its reader. Poems with their elaborate forms give us new hunches and make us hunch anew. That's how they change the world. And I believe that's the case in McGrath's poem. At the Ruins of Yankee Stadium is one of the greatest love poems to the texture and complexity of human experience that I have ever read. It's so full of life, and that fullness comes at base from the counterpoint to all moments of sweetness and wonder and bewilderment. The fact that the moment is certain to end, and that to return to the start of this presentation, that the only constant is change. This is the only city picture I had on my iPhone. It's of Calgary. It's not very crowded. I wanted more crowds. I never loved my life more than when I contemplate it ending. And I never want more for Eddie than when I imagine some vital part of our world being altered permanently. Extinction, irreversible damage, a Celsius degree. The poet Craig Arnold puts it this way: each day harder to live within, each day harder to live without. The Heisla author Eden Robinson puts it similarly. Your grief is an honor song. This is your testament to what has been lost. This is the most grueling song you'll ever sing. The cost is enormous. You stand on the beach by yourself watching a tsunami roar toward you. You sing in the face of your own destruction. It's more than my hunch, this statement being so obvious, that the sooner we awaken to the fact that there is no future to mimic some idealized past, that the future will wave at or over us or leave us in the dust if we waste more time wishing it were not so, and that the sooner we can flex and shift and care better for one another. And it's scary, but it's a start. McGrath, Armitage, and Santos Perez all remind us of that fact in their poems about the failure to fix anything in place. The only certainty is uncertainty. And I believe that's one of art's roles, to awaken our deeper, intuitive hunches, despite the brutal, marginalizing, short-focused fears of this moment. Subtler, says poetry, subtler. Here is a final poem from Empties to close. Actually, it's the final poem in Empties too, and it's called Empties. Okay, so it's all lots of that. I just want to say before I read it, because I'll just end after the poem, I have so much thanks for you attending today. And I appreciate that you've reckoned with me about all we can't control and all we can imagine in this terrible and terribly precious present. This is a Nanaimo poem also. Empties. Just as the sun leans to empty at Piper's Lagoon, and by emptying, invests itself in the water's darkening, the water's separateness, substance turned body, licking dry land clean of dullness. I'm emptying myself for you, little caster, watching you scour the rack and spume for rocks worth plunking through the dimming waves. I'm prematurely moved to teach the skipping throw. Hooked index finger, throat soft elbow crook, sudden flick for spin. Improbable, I know, but out over the deep, if aimed true between the tidal swells and fairy wakes, even a heavy stone might stave off this sinking feeling and float. Thanks.
At this point, we'd like to open it up for questions. If it's possible to get some house lights up, that would be fantastic.
There you are.
Can we get some house lights, please? That'd be great.
Go back to,
There we go.
how about that?
There we go.
Hey, y'all. I was looking for you this whole time. So there you are.
So, do we have any questions?
Hey, Mike.
To go back to Joan Talent for a moment, and her idea of that combines the idea of poetics, right? This idea. Sure. Okay. Can you hear me? Oh, either way. Yeah.
Got you.
So to go back to Joan Retalic's idea of poetics, this idea of bridging poetry inevitably, or poetics specifically, right? So that theory and practice with the ethical. I'm wondering about also this idea of relinquishment and how that coordinates with with this ethical practice that you're undergoing, right? This poetic practice that is immensely ethical, but how in that, when we think about relinquishment, we think about somehow there's this element of a feeling empty, a feeling like we have to give up something or we're powerless in this way. So maybe there's some sort of paradoxical notion about how the ethics of relinquishment, I don't know if you could say something about that, either harnessing Retalic or just from your own approach in this manuscript.
Ooh, thanks for that question. Yeah, the heart of this new manuscript in particular, the book that really changed things for me alongside Retalic is, and I wonder if anyone's read it here, Diane Seuss's Frank, which is a book of sonnets that continually kind of expand and contract. The sonnet in the very middle of the book, you actually require a fold-out page because the lines are so long. And so there's this sense of elasticity of thinking. And that was the first time where I really started thinking about this word frank, this idea of being forthright, and how those utterances can sometimes come like out of desperation. And so for me, maybe the word relinquishment is, it often, at least in these poems, feels like relinquishment under duress. And that's what I'm most curious about, because a lot of the poems that Retallick champions, they kind of like move, or they shift, or they like reject the foreclosure of like set stanzas or set rooms. They often, they feel like sets. Actually, you could put pieces in different places. Once Eddie was born, that's my son. I was kind of worried I hadn't said that. My son's name is Eddie. I said that a couple times in the presentation. It was a different kind of certainty that I had not felt in my body before, and it made it so that I was okay with using some of the larger, perhaps like conceptual or vague words that we avoid in creative writing courses. And to me, that was actually an act of relinquishment. It was the first time I ever used the word love in a poem, because it's so vacuous, and yet it felt like a desperate demand to do so. And so, I hear that interplay of relinquishment and the swerve is also this sense of a demand to act, right? Or a feeling forced to be earnest and to feel. Maybe the context I could have also provided in this presentation is that especially On High, my first book, really slinks around. It's kind of sly. There are poems that are sarcastic, even a couple of them like dunk, right, on different kinds of social performance. And the more I move away from that form towards something maybe a little more earnest, the more I feel an act of relinquishment also of my own social performance, moving away from humor even sometimes. So there's a whole gob kind of coming your way, but those are the pieces that are kind of at play.
So this makes me also think of the sirens idea. Mm-hmm. And the idea of putting wax in your ears to avoid the sirens, and sincerity is without wax. Mm-hmm. So this is that earnest, that sincere expression, right? Which that seems to be, that's part of that. The ethical side of it is this, I'm forced to speak in this way, right? I'm demanded to speak in that way. And I have to, in some ways, maybe relinquish to that. I don't know.
I also just I loved, the first poets I really started to love were the ones who were just kind of creating these little vignettes of irony. They were the ones that I started to kind of fall into as a young reader, especially. And I think that suited me because, as I talked about at the beginning of the presentation, the way that I feel anxious in the world makes it so that the poem on the page can be a space of control. It can be one where each line, each caesura, each moment of enjambment, each breath can be modulated in my own body. It's almost like a forced hunch, right? And so, I don't know, I think the more frankness comes into a poem, the harder it is to maintain that elaborate kind of Venn diagram or terrarium feeling. And that to me is, opening oneself up to Retallick's idea of the swerve being possible to come in. It's about breaking the glass. At the end of the day, it's all about breaking the glass, right? That's it. Cool. Thanks, Mike.
Hi, Neil.
Nice to see you.
It just struck me as such a tension between the urge for relinquishment and the writing down on the page. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to thank you because there's a lot of resilience and hope just in continuing to write down on the page. So thanks for sharing. It was great.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying so.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks so much, Neil, for this talk. I'm curious about the enjambment aspect of it, and I'm curious how that happens. How much attention is placed on how that looks and how that sounds when you read, and also what maybe like a higher level of that is connected with the subject of the eco-dad, the parenting, like all the improvisation involved in that. I'm just curious because clearly in some way the enjambment is like, it's manufactured, it's something that we wind up seeing the way it's presented, right? But then when you speak, it's different. And I'm curious where that term comes from, I guess, and how much of that is built into the performative aspect of this versus the document aspect of this.
I'm going to accept this alley-oop to talk for 1 second about being Poet Laureate, which is that we have these workshops coming up where once a month we'll read a poem by another poet, and then every 3 months or so, that poet will come and read to us the following week. And the reason that I really want that interplay to happen is because I think it's one of the great joys of the art form of poetry, when you can observe the enjambment on the page and then watch the poet ignore it when they read it out loud, because that is the moment where you can almost, it feels to me like, one time I was swimming across Westwood Lake. That sounds like a flex. It wasn't, but I did. And it was late at night, and I almost knocked all my teeth out on a stump that was just like an inch under the water on the other side of the lake. And it's those moments where something pushes up into our appearance in terms of like the physical, like it appears on the page to us, even though it is not audible within the reader's voice. It's that kind of like jarring doubleness that I think is like just such a cool possibility that poetry can offer. And not all poetry like subscribes to this idea of enjambment, but those moments where something vaults to the fore just because of its placement in the line is to me just such an opportunity to undercut what's being said, or to maybe like ironize it a little bit. And those moments are, I guess, another instance where I find that relinquishment kind of comes to the fore. You can do two things at once. That Armitage line, it's ways back there. Let's go there, though. The Armitage moment where we have some weeping, right? And it's like, the weep here has nothing really to do with crying, right? But because of its emphasis at the end of the line and that sense of elaboration, we feel like a sob at the same time as we watch something melt. It's all about placement. So yeah, I don't really think of enjambment as like a violent stump coming to take your teeth out, but like that is kind of the interplay, though. Something emerges out of the water, right, at the same time as another rhythm is overflowing it. And I'm like, that is my own love for that style or that kind of form. Not all poets feel it. A.E. Stallings, the poet that I mentioned, who helped me with a revision of Sirens, despises that and wants the enjambment to kind of, the poem's line should sit melodiously in the body, even at the expense of enjambment at times. And that's why her poems are so deliberate and frank and feel kind of closed off. And that is another kind of beauty. It's a beauty I adore, really. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question at all, Robin. A little bit? Okay, cool. Yeah, keep the stump there. Like I said, poems also let us associate. Maybe that's to come back to relinquishment. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Hey, Marty.
Hi, Neil. Thank you. I don't have a question. I'm just going to ramble at you for a second.
Hell yeah.
Because I want to say thank you for all the stuff that's now in my head that wasn't there before, and all the poets that you introduced me to that except Armitage and Chan, I didn't know any of the poets that you spoke of. And I think about that weeping in that line. It's also the ferry home, because of course it's the death, right? The image in the Western tradition, you can't have a ferry. Yeah. And weeping without it being
a traverse.
The Styx.
Yeah, something Stygian this way comes.
Right? But I also just want to say something about generation, because you're talking about futurity and reproduction. Mm-hmm. And as somebody who's a member of the voluntary extinction movement, i.e. not reproducing, mm-hmm. And you are somebody who is reproducing, has reproduced, is part of that investment in futurity in a different way. I think the generational issues that you raised without raising them are really important here, in the sense that my generation, which is the baby boomers, are unbelievably greedy and wasteful of the earth. And you can see in the contemporary news cycle, all these old politicians desperate to rape what's left of the planet and planets beyond, and to literally, you know, hook themselves up to the blood of younger people, like that crazy Google guy who takes his own son's blood. I keep thinking about what is the consent of that? Mm-hmm. What is that generational thing? And the poem you talked about on Yankee Stadium made me think about the murmuration of starlings on the cover, and how scientists can't figure out how starlings in those masses communicate their turns, and the role of poets and artists and writers and all the creative people in this time of unraveling with the politics so populist and dangerous. The role of all of you who are the creatives of our culture in helping us turn in the right direction. And I just want to say this was a wonderful presentation. I'm sorry the weather made the audience maybe lighter than it would have been and should have been, and I hope it lives well in its digital form and spreads, because you raised so many important points. And I just want to say thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Once again, thank you so much, Neil, for coming out and joining us today. And we do have some coffee, some refreshments outside in the lobby. If you'd like to meet us there and continue our conversation or have a chat afterwards. Thank you very much once again for coming, and thank you for being part of the Colloquium.
I'm honored to. Thanks, everyone.